Welcome to Dreamscribe, your companion on the journey to peaceful sleep. Before you drift off, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this calming community grow. Where in the world are you tuning in from? The first time Ethan saw the note, he didn't think much of it. It was a tiny, crumpled piece of paper, wedged into the narrow gap between the dashboard and the windshield of his RV. At first glance, it could have been an old receipt, some forgotten scrap left behind from one of his long nights on the road. But when he picked it up and smoothed it out, his stomach twisted. Turn back now. Ethan frowned. He glanced around the RV, checking the doors, the windows. Everything was still locked. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints on the dusty floor. He was alone. He exhaled, rubbing his face. Probably just some dumb prank. He'd been stopping at sketchy rest stops and rundown gas stations lately. Maybe some weird old guy had slipped it in while he was filling up on gas. Still, something about the note made his skin crawl. He crumpled it up and tossed it into the small trash bin next to the driver's seat. The feeling of being watched. Outside, the air was thick and heavy with the quiet stillness of the desert night. His RV was parked on the shoulder of an empty stretch of highway. No streetlights, no passing cars, just miles of darkness in every direction. The last town had been 50 miles back, and according to his GPS, the next wasn't for another 70. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling exposed. He hated stopping in the middle of nowhere like this, but he had been driving for 14 hours straight, and exhaustion had settled deep in his bones. He checked the locks again, making sure the RV was sealed up tight. Then he flicked off the cabin light and crawled into bed, pulling the blanket up to his chest. The wind howled outside, rattling the thin metal walls of the RV. He shut his eyes, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small thought nagged at him. How did that note get inside? A presence in the dark. Sometime past midnight, Ethan stirred. A noise had woken him. Not the wind, not the usual creaks and groans of the RV settling into the cold. It was something else. A soft rustling. He stayed perfectly still, his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. The sound was faint but deliberate. Something moving inside the RV. His mouth went dry. He reached under his pillow, fingers closing around the cool metal of his pocket knife. Another rustle. It came from the small kitchenette a few feet away. Ethan forced himself to breathe quietly, straining his ears. Was it an animal? A rat, maybe? But how would a rat get in? The sound stopped. For a long moment, silence pressed against him, thick and suffocating. Then, scratch. Something scraped lightly against the RV's counter. Ethan shot up, knife in hand. His pulse hammered in his ears. He flicked on the bedside lamp, bathing the small space in dim yellow light. The kitchenette was empty. He scanned the room, eyes darting to the windows, the door. Nothing was out of place. His breath came out in uneven shudders as he swung his legs over the bed and stepped forward cautiously. His gaze dropped to the counter, and his stomach dropped with it, because there, placed neatly next to his coffee mug, was another note. He swallowed hard, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. "You're not alone." Where did it come from? Ethan staggered back, his head spinning. No, this wasn't possible. He had locked the doors, checked them twice. No windows were open. Someone had been in here. Someone was still in here. He lunged for the door, yanking it open. The cold desert air rushed in, but outside was nothing but darkness. He flicked on the exterior floodlights, nothing but the cracked pavement and an endless sea of black. His fingers clenched around the note. His breaths came in short, ragged bursts. He turned back into the RV, scanning every inch, under the bed, inside the small bathroom, in every cabinet and drawer. Nothing. No intruder. No sign of forced entry. No footprints. Just the note, sitting there like it had always been there. He grabbed it and crushed it in his fist, his heart slamming against his ribs. This had to be a joke. A sick joke. Maybe he was just too tired. Maybe he had written it himself and forgotten. Yeah, that had to be it. Shaking his head, he tossed the note into the trash with the first one. He locked the door again, double-checked the windows. Then, for good measure, he jammed a chair under the doorknob. He climbed back into bed, knife still clutched in his palm. It took hours before exhaustion finally pulled him into a restless sleep. The third note. The next morning, the rising sun cast long orange streaks across the cracked highway. Ethan sat at the small table in his RV, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. He was exhausted, but he had convinced himself that last night had been nothing, just paranoia and sleep deprivation playing tricks on him. He had to keep moving. As he reached for his map, his fingers brushed against something. A folded piece of paper. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he unfolded it. His vision blurred as he read the words scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Don't stop at the next gas station." His head snapped up. Through the windshield, miles ahead, a lone gas station stood against the empty horizon. Waiting. Ethan had been living on the road for 3 years now. What had started as a spontaneous road trip after quitting his dead-end job had turned into something permanent. An endless journey of highways, cheap gas station coffee, and quiet nights parked under the vast, open sky. His RV, an aging Winnebago with a faded green stripe running down its side, had become more than just a vehicle. It was home. He had fine-tuned the nomadic lifestyle to a science. A drive during daylight. Stop before sundown. Avoid places that felt off. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but experience had taught him to trust his gut. Some places just had a bad energy, and when that feeling hit, he didn't stick around long enough to find out why. For the most part, though, life on the road was peaceful. The daily routine. Mornings were slow and quiet. Ethan would wake up with the sun, stretch his stiff muscles, and start a pot of coffee on the tiny propane stove. The scent of bitter grounds filled the cramped space as he went through his morning ritual, checking the map, planning his next stop, and making sure the RV was still in working order. Once the coffee was ready, he'd sit by the windshield, feet propped up on the dashboard, and watch the world wake up. Some mornings, it was desert landscapes stretching for miles, red rock formations glowing in the dawn light. Other mornings, it was pine-covered mountains or misty backroads lined with towering oaks. No 2 days were the same. After breakfast, he'd check his supplies, fuel, water, food, and make a mental note of anything he needed to pick up at the next stop. Then, he'd get back on the road. It was a simple life, but it was his. The rules of the road. Ethan had developed a few unspoken rules over the years, small habits that kept him safe. Never park in complete isolation. Even if it meant stopping at a rundown truck stop, being around people, even strangers, was always safer. Trust your instincts. If a place felt wrong, leave. No hesitation. Stay off the road after midnight. It was a personal superstition. Nothing good ever happened after midnight. These rules had kept him out of trouble. Until now. The first uneasy moment. The day after finding the first few notes, Ethan tried to brush it off. He had stopped at a small-town diner that morning, craving something more substantial than instant oatmeal. The place was a relic from the 60s. Checkerboard floors, faded leather booths, and a jukebox that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. As he sipped his coffee, he found himself glancing out the window, staring at the RV parked outside. A thought gnawed at the back of his mind. How were the notes getting in? He had checked the locks. He had checked the windows. There was no logical way someone could have entered without leaving a trace. But the notes were real. He had touched them, held them in his hands. The paper had been dry and crisp, the ink slightly smudged, almost as if whoever had written them had been in a hurry. And the warning on the last one, "Don't stop at the next gas station." Ethan had listened. He had driven past the station that morning, barely sparing it a glance. It had looked normal enough, just another rundown refueling spot with a flickering neon, open sign, and a row of rusted-out gas pumps. But something about it had felt wrong. There had been a car parked outside, a faded blue sedan, its driver slumped motionless over the steering wheel. At first, Ethan thought the guy was just asleep. But as he sped past, he caught a glimpse of the face. The skin was waxy and pale. The mouth hung slightly open. Not asleep. Dead. The further he drove, the harder it became to shake the feeling that if he had stopped, he wouldn't have left. The note had saved him. Trying to rationalize, Ethan spent the next few hours on the road, trying to come up with an explanation. There had to be one. Maybe some good Samaritan had somehow snuck into his RV to leave the notes. Maybe they had been trying to warn him about something real, some kind of danger ahead. But that didn't make sense. If someone had been inside, he would have noticed. The locks were never broken. There was no sign of forced entry. And that last note, how had they known about the gas station? Ethan gritted his teeth and shook his head. He wasn't going to drive himself crazy over this. Instead, he focused on the road. The highway stretched endlessly before him, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. His next stop was about 200 miles ahead, a small campground tucked deep within the woods. A good place to rest. Or so he thought. The last normal stop. Around dusk, Ethan pulled into a roadside convenience store. It was the kind of place that sold everything: chips, bottled water, beef jerky, and gas station souvenirs. He grabbed a few supplies, paid the bored-looking cashier, and made his way back to the RV. As he reached for the door handle, something caught his eye. A tiny piece of folded paper, tucked neatly into the windshield wiper. His breath hitched. Slowly, he unfolded it. For words, written in the same jagged handwriting as before. "Do not go tonight." Ethan's pulse pounded. The campground was still 50 miles away. He had planned to park there for the night, maybe stay a couple of days. But the note! He clenched his jaw, shoving the paper into his pocket. He didn't know who was leaving these warnings, but they were getting under his skin. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. He wasn't going to let paranoia dictate his decisions. And yet, a nagging feeling in his gut told him he should listen, foreshadowing what's to come. The deeper Ethan drove into the forested backroads, the heavier the air felt. The towering trees closed in on either side, swallowing the last traces of daylight. His headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the narrow, winding road ahead. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. Everything felt eerily still. Then, a cold gust of air swept through the RV, sending a chill down his spine. Ethan frowned, reaching for the temperature dial. And that's when he saw it. A new note. It sat on the dashboard, right in front of him. He hadn't placed it there. His hands trembled as he picked it up. This one wasn't a warning. It wasn't a message. It was just his name, scrawled in the same jagged handwriting. Ethan. His grip tightened around the paper. His heart slammed against his ribs. And in the rearview mirror, just for a split second, he swore he saw movement in the back of the RV. Ethan had seen the name written on the note. His name. It sat on the dashboard, in the same jagged handwriting as before. For a long moment, he just stared at it, hands clenched around the steering wheel, his pulse a slow, heavy drumbeat in his ears. His mind scrambled for an explanation. Someone had to be messing with him. But who? And how? The RV was locked. He hadn't stopped anywhere since the last note at the convenience store. No one had approached him. No one had even been nearby. And yet, the paper sat there, mocking him, proof that he was not alone. Ethan reached out with hesitant fingers, as if the note might burn him. The paper felt dry and brittle, like it had been sitting in the sun for hours. The ink looked fresh. Something about that detail unsettled him more than anything else. Because whoever left this note hadn't just known his name. They had left it while he was driving. And that meant they were inside, checking the RV. A cold shiver crawled up Ethan's spine as he slowly turned his head, scanning the dimly lit interior of the RV. The back was shrouded in shadow, the faint glow from the dashboard barely illuminating the kitchenette and the small sleeping area beyond. The cabinets were closed. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, just as he had left it. Nothing looked out of place, but Ethan had been on the road long enough to trust his instincts. Something was wrong. Keeping one hand on the steering wheel, he reached toward the glove compartment, fingers closing around the worn handle of his hunting knife. It wasn't much, but it made him feel slightly less vulnerable. With slow, measured movements, he pulled off the highway onto a narrow shoulder, tires crunching over loose gravel. The RV settled into a heavy silence as he turned off the ignition. For several seconds, he just sat there listening. Nothing. No movement. No breathing. But the air felt heavier, thick with the electric charge of something unseen. He took a deep breath and stood up. The wooden floor creaked beneath his boots as he stepped into the main cabin, gripping the knife tightly. He moved methodically, checking each cabinet, pulling open drawers, searching the tiny bathroom. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. No hiding places. The RV was empty. At least, it was supposed to be. The voice in the dark. Ethan exhaled, forcing himself to calm down. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe someone had slipped the note inside back at the convenience store when he wasn't looking. Maybe he had missed something. It was the only explanation that made sense. He tossed the note onto the counter and turned back toward the driver's seat. And then he heard it. A whisper. Soft. Low. Coming from behind him. Ethan froze. The sound had been faint, like breath against the air, but it sent an unnatural chill up his spine. He turned his head slowly, eyes scanning the darkened interior. Nothing. The note lay exactly where he had left it. The windows were still closed. He was alone. Wasn't he? His pulse thundered in his ears as he reached for his phone. The screen lit up, the glow casting eerie shadows along the walls. No signal. Of course. The next note. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, trying to shake the unease settling over him like a second skin. He needed to clear his head. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the isolation was getting to him. He turned toward the driver's seat, intending to start the RV back up. And stopped cold, because there was another note, sitting exactly where the first one had been, right on the dashboard. Ethan's breath hitched. He had left the first note on the counter. He was sure of it. He reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and unfolded the paper. This time, the message was different. It's getting closer. His entire body locked up. A spike of pure, primal fear drove into his chest, because the handwriting had changed. The previous notes had been jagged and hurried, as if scrawled in desperation. But this one, the letters were perfectly neat, deliberate, almost practiced, like whoever, or whatever, had written it had taken its time. The reflection. Ethan's breathing was shallow, his mind racing. Something wasn't right. The air in the RV had changed. It felt heavier, tighter, like something was in there with him. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to the rearview mirror. For a split second, he saw nothing but the dimly lit interior behind him. The small bed, the kitchenette. But then, movement, a shadow. It shifted in the corner of the mirror, there 1 second, gone the next. Ethan whipped around. Nothing. The space was empty, but he had seen it. Something had been there. His chest rose and fell in sharp, panicked breaths. He needed to get the hell out of here. Shoving the note into his pocket, he jumped back into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. He exhaled, hands shaking. He didn't know what was happening, but he wasn't about to stick around and find out. He slammed his foot on the gas, tearing down the highway, the trees blurring past in the darkness. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the headlights carving a narrow path through the night. And then, from the corner of his eye, a white piece of paper, tucked beneath the passenger side windshield wiper. His stomach lurched. No, that wasn't possible. There was no way someone had placed it there. Not while he was driving. His grip tightened on the wheel. Don't look, but his eyes betrayed him. Just for a second, they flicked to the note. And in that moment, a figure flickered in the windshield's reflection, sitting in the passenger seat. Just for a split second, long enough for Ethan to register dark, empty eyes staring back at him. Long enough for the corners of its mouth to curl into a slow, unnatural smile. Then, it was gone. Ethan gasped, his heart hammering against his ribs. His hands trembled as he yanked the windshield wiper switch. The note fluttered away into the night. But he knew there would be more. And next time, they might not just be warnings. Running from the unknown. Ethan's hands were locked around the steering wheel, his knuckles pale and rigid. The road stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by the dim glow of his headlights. The trees lining the highway blurred into shadowy walls as he sped forward. He didn't care about speed limits. He didn't care about the gas gauge dipping dangerously low. All he cared about was getting away. Away from the notes. Away from whatever had written them. Away from the thing in the passenger seat reflection. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe he was hallucinating. Maybe exhaustion was warping his perception. But deep down he knew. This was real. The gas station refuge. An illuminated sign flickered in the distance, a beacon of hope in the otherwise lifeless highway. Gas, food, restrooms. Ethan veered onto the exit, the RV's tires screeching against the pavement as he pulled into the near-empty lot of a 24-hour gas station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an artificial glow over the pavement. Ethan jumped out, his boots crunching against the gravel, eyes scanning the parking lot. A single pickup truck was parked by the convenience store entrance. No one else was around. He shoved the driver's side door shut and hurried inside. The cool air conditioning hit him like a slap. The store smelled of stale coffee and cleaning supplies. A bored-looking cashier, a man in his 40s with graying stubble, glanced up from his phone. Ethan made a beeline for the counter. "Hey man," he panted. Have you seen anyone hanging around outside? Like near my RV?" The cashier blinked slowly. "Nope." Ethan licked his lips, his pulse still hammering. "Are there cameras? I think someone's been breaking into my RV." The man sighed, setting his phone down. "Cameras don't work half the time. You should call the cops if you're having trouble." Ethan ran a shaky hand through his hair. The cops. Would they even believe him? It's getting closer. The note's words echoed in his mind, cold and taunting. The thing inside his RV had written it, and now he had abandoned his vehicle. Had he just made a mistake? The longer he stayed in here, the more he felt like a sitting duck. His eyes flicked toward the store windows. The RV sat beneath a flickering overhead light, its windshield reflecting the empty lot. Empty. But what if it wasn't? What if something was watching him from inside? The thought made his stomach twist. He turned back to the cashier. "You sell weapons?" The man raised an eyebrow. "What kind?" "A bat. A knife. Anything." The cashier snorted. "This ain't a hardware store, buddy." Ethan exhaled sharply. He needed something. Anything. His eyes landed on a rack of heavy-duty flashlights. Thick. Metal. It would have to do. He grabbed one, slapping a few crumpled bills onto the counter. The cashier rang it up without comment. Ethan turned back toward the entrance, steeling himself. The RV sat motionless outside. It looked the same, but he knew better. Something was waiting for him. Back into the RV. Ethan stepped out of the gas station, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Each step toward the RV felt heavier. The air was thick, charged with something unseen. His breath fogged slightly as he exhaled. The temperature had dropped. That wasn't normal. He hesitated at the door, listening. Silence. No movement. No whispers. Still, his skin crawled. He reached for the handle, his fingers tightening around the cold metal. Then, a flicker in the windshield's reflection. A figure in the passenger seat. His heart slammed against his ribs. But when he turned, nothing. The seat was empty. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself inside. The air inside the RV was different. Colder. Thicker. Like the walls themselves were breathing. The dashboard was clear. No new notes. He locked the door behind him and took a cautious step forward. His duffel bag was still on the counter where he had left it, his jacket draped over the chair. But then his eyes landed on the small dining table. A single sheet of paper, sitting exactly in the center. Ethan's pulse spiked. No, he hadn't left a note there. He knew he hadn't. Slowly he approached, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. The handwriting was different again. Sharper. Almost eager. "You can't leave." A sharp knock rang out. Not from the door. Not from the windows. From the bathroom. Ethan went completely still. His fingers tightened around the note. The knock came again. Soft. Measured. From inside. The bathroom door was closed. He had checked it earlier. He had searched the entire RV. He had been alone. Hadn't he? A whisper. Muffled. Just behind the door. Ethan. His name. It knew his name. His throat closed up. He couldn't move. Then, a new sound. Paper. The rustling of paper sliding beneath the door. Ethan's entire body locked. A note had just been pushed out. His legs felt like stone as he approached. The paper was slightly curled, the ink still drying. He bent down slowly, pulse roaring in his ears. 3 words, scrawled with deliberate, careful strokes. "Open the door." No. No. Ethan stumbled backward, his breath ragged. The air in the RV shifted. Something moved behind the bathroom door. The handle twisted. Slow. Deliberate. Click. It began to open. No. Ethan bolted. The final attempt to escape. He lunged for the driver's seat, shoving the keys into the ignition with trembling hands. The engine roared to life. From the corner of his eye, the bathroom door swung open. He didn't look. Couldn't look. The RV lurched forward as he stomped on the gas. The road flew beneath him, headlights cutting through the darkness. Faster. Faster. He needed to get away. But something felt different. Wrong. The RV wasn't empty. He could feel it now. A presence. Sitting just behind him. Watching. He risked a glance at the rearview mirror. A face. Just for a split second. A smile. Then, the entire RV shuddered. The dashboard lights flickered. A single note fluttered from the ceiling, landing gently in his lap. He didn't want to read it, but he had to. He lifted the paper with trembling hands. A new message. "See you soon." Ethan's stomach dropped. He wasn't escaping. He never had been. The game had just begun. A question with no answer. Ethan drove in silence. The wheels hummed against the pavement, but the sound felt distant, like it belonged to another world. He couldn't stop thinking about the note. "See you soon." The message sat on the passenger seat beside him, stark against the dim glow of the dashboard lights. It had been waiting for him. It knew he would find it. The entity, whatever it was, wasn't just toying with him anymore. It was guiding him. But to what? Ethan's jaw tightened as he glanced at the fuel gauge. Less than a quarter tank left. He would have to stop again soon. And he couldn't do that alone. Not anymore. Not with it watching. The first lead. He needed help. He needed answers. His mind raced, searching for a solution. Who could he call? The police? No. They'd think he was insane. He could already hear the conversation in his head. Sir, are you saying someone is breaking into your RV? Not exactly. I don't know how they're getting inside. Is anything stolen? No, but... Sir, have you been drinking tonight? No. The cops wouldn't believe him. But someone might. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Then he saw it, Caleb. Ethan hadn't spoken to him in years, but back in college, Caleb had been obsessed with paranormal theories. Ghosts, cryptids, urban legends. If it was supernatural, Caleb had read about it. Ethan hesitated for only a second before tapping the call button. The phone rang, and rang, and, yo! Ethan exhaled in relief. Caleb, it's Ethan. There was a pause. Then, curiosity edged Caleb's voice. Ethan? Damn, man. Been a minute. You good? No, he was not good. But he couldn't just blurt out the truth. Not yet. I need your help, Ethan said. Something weird is happening, and I don't know who else to call. Caleb chuckled. Weird? What kind of weird? Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel. You believe in ghosts, right? A beat of silence. Then, tell me everything. A dangerous theory. Ethan pulled into an abandoned rest stop, his heart hammering. For the next 20 minutes, he spilled everything. The notes, the whispers, the knocking from the bathroom, the face in the mirror. Caleb listened without interruption. When Ethan finally stopped talking, there was a long silence on the other end. Then Caleb exhaled. Shit, he muttered. That's classic attachment behavior. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? It means, Caleb said carefully, this thing, whatever it is, it's not just haunting you. It's following you. You said the notes keep appearing inside your locked RV, right? That means it's already attached to you. And if that's true, you can't just drive away from it. Ethan's stomach sank. So what do I do? Caleb hesitated. First, I need to know something important. Has it ever physically touched you? Ethan swallowed hard. No. Good, Caleb said quickly. That means you still have a chance. But listen to me, Ethan. Do not engage with it. No talking to it. No answering its messages. And for the love of God, do not open any doors when it knocks. You need to break the attachment before it gets stronger. Ethan's pulse pounded. How do I do that? You have to figure out why it's attached to you in the first place. Spirits don't latch onto people randomly. There's always a reason. Ethan ran a hand over his face. I don't know, man. It started a few days ago. I was just driving. Caleb's voice sharpened. Where were you? Ethan thought back. The past few days were a blur of empty highways and sleepless nights. Then, his breath caught. The gas station. The beginning of the nightmare. 3 nights ago. A small, rundown gas station on the side of a deserted highway. It had been late, past midnight. He had stopped only for fuel. There was an old man behind the counter. Wrinkled, hunched, and barely paying attention. Ethan had handed him a 20, gotten his change, and was about to leave when... The box. It had been sitting on the counter. Small. Wooden. The kind of thing you'd see at an antique store. Ethan hadn't even thought about it at the time. He had only noticed it because there was a note sticking out from the lid. The words had been handwritten. Messy. Urgent. Don't take this. Ethan had chuckled at the time, thinking it was some kind of joke. But before he could ask, the old man had shoved the box toward him. Just take it. Ethan had frowned. I don't. Free. Just take it. Something in the man's eyes had unsettled him. But Ethan had taken the box anyway. It was still in his RV, sitting inside the glove compartment, waiting. The truth comes out. Caleb exhaled sharply when Ethan finished telling him. Jesus, he muttered. Ethan, that's it. That's your link. That's what started all of this. Ethan's throat was dry. What do I do? Get rid of it, Caleb said immediately. But listen, this is important. You can't just throw it away. That won't work. You have to return it. Back to where you got it. Ethan stared out at the dark highway ahead. The thought of going back to that gas station made his skin crawl. But if that was the only way to break the attachment, he had no choice. He had to go back. The final warning. As Ethan turned the RV around, his heart pounded with every mile that passed. The road felt longer this time. The night darker. Then, a flutter. From the passenger seat, Ethan's blood ran cold. Another note. He didn't pick it up immediately. He just stared at it. His hands clenched the wheel, his breathing shallow. Finally, he forced himself to look. The handwriting was different again, more violent, scratched deep into the paper. 4 words. You can't return it. Ethan's hands trembled. He was driving straight into something he didn't understand. And the entity knew. 6. The final night. A journey into darkness. Ethan had never been more terrified. The RV rumbled down the empty highway, headlights cutting through the suffocating darkness. The note sat on the dashboard, its message burned into his mind. You can't return it. His hands gripped the wheel. He could barely breathe. The gas station was still miles away, and something knew he was coming. The air inside the RV felt wrong, heavy, like the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his skin. Ethan swallowed hard, his knuckles turning white. He had made his choice. Now he had to see it through. An unseen passenger. The road stretched out endlessly. The trees lining the highway were skeletal in the dim light, their branches reaching like twisted fingers. Then, a whisper. Soft. Close. Ethan's pulse slammed against his ribs. He flicked his eyes toward the passenger seat. Empty, but his gut twisted. He wasn't alone. The whisper came again, threading through the silence. Ethan. His breath hitched. The voice was inside the RV. A silent nightmare. Ethan kept his eyes forward. Don't look. Don't engage. Caleb's words echoed in his head. Do not interact with it. That's what it wants. His heartbeat thundered. He reached for the radio, fingers trembling. Music. He needed noise, anything to drown it out. But before he could turn the dial, a new note slid into view, right across the dashboard, as if invisible hands had pushed it toward him. Ethan's blood turned to ice. The ink was wet, fresh. The letters were jagged. Desperate. Why won't you look at me? A breath, cold as death, ghosted over his neck. Something was behind him. Ethan clenched his jaw, muscles locking. Don't turn. Don't react. His foot pressed harder on the gas. The road that shouldn't exist. The miles blurred. Ethan forced himself to focus on the road, ignoring the oppressive weight of something unseen lingering at his back. The GPS flickered. For a split second, the screen glitched. Then, the entire map changed. Ethan's stomach dropped. The gas station was gone. The screen now displayed one endless road. No turns. No intersections. No destination. Panic clawed up his throat. This wasn't possible. He had just checked the route. But the longer he stared at the screen, the more it felt like the road itself had shifted. Like it was leading him somewhere else. Somewhere he wasn't supposed to go. A wrong turn into nowhere. Ethan's fingers dug into the wheel. Do not let it control you. Caleb's warning rang in his head. He needed to force his own path. Without thinking, Ethan yanked the wheel to the right, veering onto an unmarked road. The RV jolted violently as tires hit gravel. Branches scraped against the sides, the trees pressing closer, too close. For a brief, heart-stopping second, Ethan felt like he had driven straight into a tunnel of blackness. Then, the RV lurched. The engine coughed, and the world went silent. Trapped in the void, the headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. Then, the engine cut out completely. Ethan's breath came in short, uneven gasps. He turned the key. Nothing. He tried again. The engine refused to start. A new horror clawed at him. The road behind him, gone. Where the highway had been, there was now only trees. Thick, towering shadows that stretched endlessly in every direction. The road had sealed itself shut. His fingers shook as he reached for his phone. No signal. No way out. Then, in the suffocating stillness, a slow, deliberate knock. From inside the bathroom, the final warning. Ethan's entire body locked up. The knock came again. This time louder. More insistent. His mouth went dry. He knew what was behind that door. He had heard it knocking before. But this time, it wasn't asking for permission. It was demanding it. Then, a whisper. Right by his ear. You brought me here. The air plunged into ice. Ethan could see his breath fogging in front of him. Something moved in the reflection of the windshield. A shape. A figure sitting in the passenger seat. Just a dark outline. Watching him. Waiting. Another note slid onto his lap. He didn't want to look, but his eyes were drawn to it. Open the door. A choice that cannot be undone. Every nerve in Ethan's body screamed no. But his fingers trembled toward the handle. Something deep inside of him, something primal, wanted to obey. The knock came again. Louder. The handle of the bathroom door twisted. The whisper was right behind him now. Let me out. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. This isn't real. This isn't real. A hand, ice cold, brushed against the back of his neck. He snapped his eyes open. The passenger seat was empty. The reflection in the windshield was gone. But the note in his lap had changed. New words. A final message. If you don't open it, I will. The handle of the bathroom door turned all the way. And the lock clicked open. 7. The resolution and twist. A door that shouldn't open. The handle of the bathroom door twisted. The lock clicked. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. He could feel something shifting inside the RV, an invisible presence pressing against reality itself. The moment stretched out too long. Then, the door creaked open, inch by inch. The darkness beyond it was too deep, like the inside of a cave that had never known light. A shape unfolded from the void. Tall, thin, wrong. Ethan couldn't move. His body was locked in place by a terror so deep it felt like his mind was splitting apart. The thing stepped forward. It had no face, but its head tilted, watching him, waiting, and then slowly it raised its hand. In its long, bony fingers was another note. Ethan didn't want to take it, didn't want to see the words, but his hand moved on its own. The paper was warm, as if it had been written just now. He looked down, and his stomach dropped. You were never meant to see me. The air collapsed inward. The RV lurched. Everything blurred. And then, Ethan was somewhere else. The impossible returned. He gasped awake. The RV was moving. His hands were on the wheel. The highway stretched ahead, empty and endless. His breath hitched. What just happened? He glanced around. Everything looked normal. The dashboard, the empty passenger seat. No signs of whatever had just unfolded. It was like the last hour had been erased. Had he imagined it? His eyes flicked to the clock. 1:47 a.m. But that was impossible. The last time he checked, it had been 3:12 a.m. The note that shouldn't exist. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. No signal. Of course. With a shaky breath, Ethan gripped the wheel. Just keep driving. Get to a town. Get to people. Then, a flicker. Something moved in the corner of his vision. He whipped his head around. The passenger seat. Empty, but in the reflection of the windshield. For a split second, a figure sat beside him. Its head slowly turned. Ethan slammed the brakes. The RV skidded, tires screeching against the pavement. The figure vanished. His pulse pounded in his ears. Silence. Nothing but the hum of the engine. Ethan's hands shook as he ran them through his hair. Losing it. I'm losing it. Then, a new note. Right on the dashboard. His blood turned to ice. He hadn't put it there. No one had. Heart hammering, he slowly unfolded it. The ink was still wet. Don't stop driving. A choice that cannot be undone. Ethan swallowed hard. The road stretched ahead, bathed in shadows. If he kept driving, would he ever find his way out? Or was he already too far gone? The words on the note burned in his mind. Somewhere in the distance, a new note fluttered onto the floor. The last one he would ever read. His breath caught in his throat as he picked it up. 3 words. A final warning. You're not alone. Behind him, something breathed. The RV's lights flickered, and Ethan finally understood. He had never been driving alone, and he never would be again. Next story. The high beams cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow, winding stretch of road flanked by towering pine trees. The air outside was thick, unmoving, no wind, no rustling leaves, just the low hum of the RV's tires on asphalt. Jake exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel. It had been a long day, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd been driving for hours, passing nothing but endless highway and the occasional flickering roadside sign. He hadn't seen another vehicle in at least 40 minutes. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m. Almost there. Jake had booked a spot at Hollow Pines Campground, a small, off-the-grid RV park nestled deep in the forest. It was cheap, secluded, and had just enough electricity to charge his phone and keep the lights on. Exactly what he needed, a quiet place to unplug, reset, and forget about the mess he left behind back home. He adjusted the side mirror, making sure he was staying centered in his lane. That's when he saw it. A figure, standing by the roadside, just beyond the glow of his headlights. Jake's stomach clenched. It had been so quick, a dark, humanoid shape, barely visible through the murky night, standing motionless on the shoulder of the road. He whipped his head toward the passenger window to get a better look. Nothing. The road was empty. Jake swallowed hard. He wasn't imagining things. He saw someone, he was sure of it. A drifter? A hitchhiker? He shook it off. It didn't matter. He wasn't stopping. Still, an uneasy chill crept up his spine. He flicked his gaze back to the side mirror, just for a second. The figure was closer. Jake's chest tightened, a pulse of cold adrenaline surging through his veins. His hands clenched the steering wheel tighter. No, that was impossible. The road was long and straight. He would have seen them moving. But the figure hadn't walked. It hadn't run. It had just appeared. In the mirror. Jake took a sharp breath and forced his eyes forward. His heartbeat thudded in his ears as he kept his focus on the road, refusing to check again. It's nothing. It's a trick of the light. A shadow from the trees. A voice in his head reassured him. But another voice, one much lower, colder, quieter, whispered something else. You know what you saw? By the time Jake reached Hollow Pines, he was practically vibrating with tension. The wooden entrance sign loomed ahead, the faded letters barely visible in the dim glow of his headlights. The campground was silent. No office, no visible staff, just a small row of empty RVs parked along the tree line. He spotted his designated space near the end of the lot and pulled in, shutting off the engine. For a moment, he sat in the driver's seat, breathing heavily, hands still gripping the wheel. It was fine. He was fine. With a deep exhale, he finally turned his head, letting his gaze drift toward the side mirror once more. Nothing. Jake let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Jesus, I need some sleep. Still, the unease refused to fade completely. He stepped out of the RV, the cold night air wrapping around him like a damp shroud. The campground smelled like wet leaves and distant pine. His boots crunched softly against the gravel as he double-checked the locks on the doors and compartments. He glanced around at the other parked RVs. No lights. No movement. No sign of life. Jake was alone. That was fine. That was the plan. But just as he was about to step inside, a faint creak echoed from somewhere behind him. Jake's breath hitched. He turned slowly, scanning the darkness. The trees swayed just slightly, whispering in the stillness. There was nothing there. Still that sound. It hadn't come from the forest. It had come from his RV. More specifically, from the mirror. Inside, the RV felt smaller than usual, like the walls were closing in. Jake locked the door, set his phone on the counter, and flicked on the small kitchenette light. The warm glow did little to shake the feeling creeping through his bones. He needed to shake this off. Jake grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and settled into the driver's seat, forcing himself to scroll through his phone, distracting his mind. But his gaze kept drifting, kept pulling toward the mirror. The reflection of the empty road behind him sat perfectly still. Nothing there. Still, the feeling of being watched refused to fade. Go to bed. Forget it. Jake forced himself up, flicked off the kitchen light, and climbed into the small bed at the back of the RV. He closed his eyes. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then, creak. His eyes snapped open. The sound again. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was the side mirror. Jake sat up, heart hammering. The RV was locked. The curtains were drawn. But somehow, he knew he wasn't alone. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. With slow, deliberate movements, he turned on the RV's security camera feed. The screen flickered to life. The grainy black and white footage displayed the outside of the RV, just a still, quiet night. And then, the side mirror moved. Jake's breath hitched. No wind. No impact. No visible cause. The mirror shifted slightly, tilting just enough that it no longer reflected the road, but something else. A dark shape, standing directly behind the RV. Jake's entire body went rigid with fear. The figure was there, tall, unmoving, but distorted, as if the mirror itself was warping its reflection. Jake swallowed hard. The logical part of his brain screamed. It's just a shadow, a trick of the angle. But the other part, the primal, instinctive part, knew better. Slowly, he reached for the curtain, fingers trembling. One pull, one quick look, just to prove to himself that nothing was there. He yanked it open. Nothing. The outside was empty. The figure, only visible in the mirror, was gone. Jake's pulse pounded against his skull. His breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. But then he made a terrifying realization. The mirror had shifted its angle. And now, it was facing the RV's window, the one he was looking through. Jake's reflection stared back at him. And just behind his shoulder, a dark figure loomed in the mirror's glass, staring directly at him. Jake spun around. Nothing. Just the quiet, empty RV. But in the mirror, the figure had moved closer, and for the first time, it smiled. Morning came with a faint gray light filtering through the curtains. The world outside was still, the air thick with the scent of damp pine and the distant whisper of rustling leaves. Jake sat up in bed, his muscles aching from an uneasy sleep. His mind was foggy, still tangled in the lingering unease of the night before. The mirror. The thought struck like a hammer. The thing he saw. The shape. The smile. He turned sharply, eyes darting toward the side mirror outside. It was exactly where it had been before, tilted slightly off-center from where he remembered. His pulse ticked upward. Had he imagined it? He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't crazy. He had seen something. Still, the daylight made it easier to push it aside. He climbed out of bed, stretching as he moved to the small kitchenette, where the ritual of normalcy began. Coffee. Breakfast. Checking his phone, though he had barely any signal out here. This was supposed to be a reset. For the past few months, his life had been a cycle of dead-end jobs, unpaid bills, and burned bridges. Living in an RV was supposed to be temporary, but the weeks had stretched into months, and now this was his only home. Hollow Pines had seemed like a perfect place to disappear for a while, but something about it felt off. Jake shook it off. He had been on the road too long. Too much time alone could mess with your head. After breakfast, he stepped outside, letting the crisp morning air settle over him. The other RVs sat silent and empty, their curtains drawn. He hadn't seen another person since he arrived. Was he really the only one here? Jake circled the RV, forcing himself to inspect the side mirror in daylight. It was normal, just glass and metal, reflecting the empty road behind him. No figures, no shadows, no warped images. See, just a stupid trick of the light. And yet, something still felt wrong. With a slight frown, he reached out and adjusted it back to its proper position. For a split second, as the angle shifted, something flickered. A brief, distorted image. Too quick to register. Jake's breath caught. He froze, staring into the mirror. But the image was gone. Nope, he muttered, stepping away. He wasn't doing this to himself. Not again. Determined to ground himself in reality, Jake spent the rest of the day in normal routines. He cleaned the RV, wiping down every surface, making the small space feel less claustrophobic. He organized his belongings. Clothes, supplies, the scattered remnants of a life that used to be more stable. He even took a short walk around the campground, trying to enjoy the scenery instead of dwelling on his growing discomfort. The forest surrounding Hollow Pines was beautiful but eerily silent. No distant campfires, no murmurs of conversation, just rows of empty RVs and an unsettling stillness. Jake tried to convince himself it was peaceful, but peace didn't come. Instead, he kept catching glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision. A shape, a flicker of motion. Every time he turned his head, nothing. Just his own reflection in the RV's windows. Or was it? By early evening, Jake decided to check out the campground's main office. The building sat at the park's entrance, a small, rustic structure with a single dim porch light. The door was unlocked. Inside, the office smelled of dust and old paper, the walls lined with faded maps and outdated brochures. A single desk sat in the center of the room, cluttered with weathered logbooks. Behind it, an old man sat hunched over, lazily flipping through a magazine. His name tag read Earl. Jake cleared his throat. "Hey, are there other people staying here?" Earl glanced up. His eyes were murky, unreadable. "Few," he muttered, turning a page. Jake frowned. "I haven't seen anyone." Earl smirked without humor. "People keep to themselves out here." Something about the way he said it didn't sit right. Jake shifted. "Is there a problem with the mirrors in this place?" Earl's expression didn't change, but something in his demeanor stiffened. "Mirrors show what's already there." The words hung in the air like the scent of something rotting. Jake felt his stomach twist. Before he could respond, Earl turned the page in his magazine and muttered, "Best not to look too long." Jake's skin prickled. Something told him that was all he was going to get. By the time Jake made it back to his RV, the sun was sinking. The campground looked different in the dimming light. The shadows stretched longer, darker, as if they were reaching. A nervous energy settled over him as he locked the door. He checked his phone. One bar. No new messages. No updates. The mirror lurked just outside, waiting. Jake hesitated before pulling the curtain shut. He wouldn't look. Not tonight. Instead, he turned on the small TV mounted to the RV wall. Static. No signal. A flicker of unease crawled up his spine. Every other campground he'd been to had at least a few working channels. But here, nothing. He tried to convince himself it didn't matter. He settled into bed, breathing slow, forcing normalcy. Tomorrow he'd leave. Tomorrow he'd be somewhere else. Tomorrow this would all just be a weird memory. Somewhere in the haze of exhaustion, Jake drifted into an uneasy sleep. Until, creak, his eyes snapped open. The sound was familiar. The mirror. His chest tightened. It was happening again. He lay still, ears straining. For a long moment, nothing. Just the night. The silence. The feeling of something watching. And then, soft, subtle, but unmistakable. A breath. Not his own. Coming from right outside the window. Jake's body went rigid. His pulse hammered so loud he swore whoever, or whatever, was outside could hear it. He turned his head, inch by inch, gaze drifting toward the thin curtain covering the mirror. A dark shape loomed just beyond the fabric. Not a reflection. Something else. Something waiting. His hand hovered inches from the curtain. A choice. Pull it open, or pretend he hadn't seen. His fingers trembled. And then, from behind the glass, a slow, deliberate knock. Jake's heart stopped. The knocking didn't come from the RV door. It came from the side mirror. The knock came again. Soft. Hollow. Insistent. Jake's breath hitched in his throat. It's not real. It can't be real. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think. Someone had to be messing with him. A prank. Maybe Earl, or some drunk from another RV. But no. He had seen that shadow. And the knocking was coming from the side mirror. The thin curtain still hung over it. A fragile barrier between him and whatever was out there. His fingers twitched. He could pull it back. Do it. But every instinct screamed not to. Jake swallowed hard. Instead of opening the curtain, he reached for his phone. He turned on the camera, switched it to selfie mode, and angled it toward the mirror, without looking directly. The screen loaded, showing the dim interior of his RV. The curtain was still drawn. No movement. No shadow. But then, a shape materialized. Tall. Slender. Wrong. A dark figure, standing just beyond the mirror. Jake's breath hitched. The thing in the mirror wasn't outside. It was inside the reflection. A shudder tore through his spine. His hand trembled, barely holding onto the phone as the figure began to tilt its head. The motion was unnatural, like something testing the limits of a body it didn't fully understand. Slowly, painfully, it bent its neck too far. A sickening crackle filled the silence. Jake slammed the phone down. The knock came again. Louder. More urgent. His chest heaved. Do not look. Do not look. But then the whisper came. Jake. He choked on his own breath. It wasn't just a whisper. It was his own voice. Jake's stomach twisted. He grabbed the closest thing he could, his pocket knife, and bolted for the door. But the second his fingers touched the lock, everything went silent. No more knocking. No whispers. Just the night. His pulse thundered in his ears as he slowly turned back to the mirror. He didn't want to look. He had to look. With slow, mechanical movements, he reached for the curtain. He counted in his head. 1, 2, 3. He yanked it open. The mirror reflected the empty forest behind him. Nothing else. No figure. No shadow. Just the ordinary world. Jake exhaled shakily, his body still tense. Maybe it was a stress dream. Maybe he'd finally cracked from the isolation. But just as his body began to relax, his reflection moved. Jake froze. He wasn't moving, but his reflection was. It stared back at him with a twisted, unsettling expression, one he wasn't making. Then the reflection raised a hand. But Jake's hand stayed at his side. The blood drained from his face. That's not me. The reflection's mouth stretched wide, too wide. And then it whispered, Help me. Jake stumbled back, slamming into the RV wall. His reflection's eyes darkened into two empty voids. A deep, crackling distortion filled the air, like a radio struggling for signal. And then, it reached through the glass. The mirror's surface ripples like water as fingers begin to emerge. Jake's body acted before his mind could. He grabbed the nearest towel and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. Everything stopped. No whispering. No movement. Silence. Jake stood there, panting, his entire body trembling. He didn't know how long he stayed like that, but one thing was clear. He wasn't alone in the reflection. And it wanted out. Jake didn't sleep. He couldn't. Instead, he sat on his small RV couch, gripping his knife with white knuckles, watching the mirror. The towel remained in place, but he swore he could feel something moving underneath it. He had to get out of here. As soon as morning came, he'd drive as far as possible from Hollow Pines. He glanced at his phone. 2:47 a.m. 3 more hours until sunrise. The RV was silent. Still. Until a slow, dragging sound echoed from the mirror, like nails against glass. Jake's breath caught. The towel shifted. Something was pushing against it. His heartbeat thundered. And then the whisper came back. But this time, it was directly behind him. Jake. His stomach plummeted. He spun, but there was nothing there. And then, bang. Something slammed against the mirror from the inside. The towel flew off. Jake's reflection stood there, hands pressed against the glass. But it wasn't his reflection anymore. Its smile stretched too wide. Its eyes were deep voids. And worse, it wasn't moving with him. Jake lunged for the door. But the second he unlocked it, his reflection whispered, "If you leave, I take your place." Jake's entire body went cold. He turned back slowly. The reflection's grin widened. And then, it raised a hand and touched the glass. Jake felt an icy touch against his own skin. It wasn't just mimicking him anymore. It was connected to him. Panic swelled in his throat. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy wrench, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered. For a split second, the entire RV was filled with distorted static, like an old TV losing signal. And then silence. Jake's chest heaved. The mirror was broken. His reflection was gone. He staggered backward, heart still hammering. It was over. It had to be over. But then, in the corner of his vision, a new mirror. The small bathroom mirror on the RV wall. His breath hitched. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned toward it. The glass was perfectly intact. But his reflection? It was still smiling. And this time it blinked first. Jake sat in the driver's seat of his RV, gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. The first light of dawn trickled through the trees, casting a pale glow over the empty campground. But even in daylight, the air felt wrong. Cold. Heavy. Like something was still watching him. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror. For a moment, it reflected only him. But then, a flicker. A shadow in the side mirror. Jake wrenched his gaze away, heart hammering. He didn't care what that thing was. He slammed the RV into drive, tires kicking up gravel as he sped out of the campsite. The road ahead stretched empty, winding through the dense forest. Jake forced himself to focus. Get to the highway. Get to people. Get the hell out. But then, the GPS glitched. The soft robotic voice crackled, repeating the same phrase over and over. Recalculating, recalculating, recalculating. Jake's grip tightened. The road didn't look right. He had driven this way before, but now the turns seemed too sharp, the trees too dense, and the sun wasn't getting any higher. His stomach nodded. Am I even going the right way? He glanced at the side mirror, and nearly swerved off the road. The shadow was there, but this time it wasn't just a flicker. It was closer, a dark figure standing inside the mirror, keeping pace with the RV, without moving. Jake's breathing turned ragged. He stomped on the gas, the RV roaring down the road. But no matter how fast he went, the shadow stayed right there, watching, waiting. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. Jake's hands were numb from gripping the wheel, but the highway never appeared. His phone had zero signal. The GPS kept repeating the same message. And worst of all, the road kept looping. The first time he noticed, he tried to convince himself he was imagining things. The second time, his stomach dropped. By the third time, he knew. He was trapped. The same broken fence. The same leaning road sign. The same sun, frozen in the same spot. Jake slammed the brakes. The RV skidded to a stop, gravel crunching beneath the tires. He sat there, hands trembling. This was impossible. Unless... Jake swallowed hard. His gaze flickered toward the side mirror. The shadow was still there. Closer now. It had moved. Jake clenched his teeth. No. He refused to accept this. He threw the RV into reverse, spinning the wheel hard, making a complete U-turn. If the road looped one way, maybe it wouldn't loop backward. The RV lurched forward. Trees blurred past. 5 minutes. 10. Jake's heart pounded. And then, his stomach plummeted. The same leaning road sign. The same broken fence. No matter which way he drove, he ended up back here. Panic crawled up his throat. The shadow in the mirror tilted its head, like it was mocking him. Jake let out a shaky breath. He was never getting out of here. Unless he changed tactics. Jake's gaze hardened. The mirrors. Every time he saw that thing, it was through a mirror. Maybe if he destroyed them. Without hesitating, he reached for the side mirror, gripping the edge. The cold metal stung his fingertips. His reflection stared back at him, face pale and drawn. But then, it smiled. Jake's breath caught. His own reflection was grinning. Not a normal grin. Something stretched and unnatural. And then, the reflection moved first. Jake hadn't moved, but his reflection did. His stomach turned, and then it whispered, "Don't." Jake ripped the mirror off. It hit the ground with a sharp crack. The second it shattered, a piercing static noise filled the air. Jake clamped his hands over his ears, teeth gritting against the sound. And just like that, it stopped. The road felt clearer, lighter. For the first time, the sun actually moved. Jake's pulse hammered. It worked. He had to break every mirror. Jake didn't hesitate. He stumbled back inside the RV, heart racing. He needed to destroy the rearview mirror, the bathroom mirror, every last one. He grabbed his wrench. His breath came fast and shallow as he stepped into the cramped bathroom. The mirror above the sink stared back at him, and for a split second, his reflection was normal. No twisted smiles, no delayed movements. Just him. Jake gritted his teeth. He raised the wrench. And then, the reflection spoke. "If you break me, you'll never leave." Jake froze. The voice was his own. A perfect copy. His own face tilted its head, eyes full of something almost amused. Jake's knuckles turned white around the wrench. "You're lying." The reflection's smile widened. "Are you sure?" Jake's pulse thundered. He should just smash it. But what if? No. He shook the thought away. It was trying to mess with him. With a sharp inhale, Jake swung the wrench. Glass shattered, and the world tilted. For a few horrifying seconds, Jake's vision blurred. The RV shook violently, like an earthquake was tearing through it. The radio crackled. The lights flickered. And then, it stopped. Jake panted, chest heaving. He staggered back into the main cabin of the RV. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then he looked at the windows, and his blood ran cold. They weren't windows anymore. They were mirrors. Every single window in the RV reflected him back. And in each one, his reflection was smiling. Jake stumbled backward. The trap had tightened. He hadn't destroyed it. He'd made it stronger. The whispers returned, overlapping, distorting. His own voice, coming from every mirror. "You can't run. You can't hide. Let me in." Jake slammed his hands over his ears. He had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. And now, the reflection was everywhere. Watching. Waiting. And soon, it wouldn't need a mirror to reach him. Jake sat hunched in the driver's seat of the RV, drenched in sweat. The mirrors, they were everywhere now. Every window, every reflective surface inside the RV showed his reflection. And in all of them, his reflection wasn't right. It smiled when he didn't. It moved when he stayed still. And worst of all, it whispered. Low, distorted voices, layering over each other like a chorus of his own twisted echoes. "Jake, you shouldn't have done that. You broke the mirror, but you didn't break me. You let me in." Jake clamped his hands over his ears. It didn't help. His own voice, mocking, taunting, unraveling him. He had to get out of here. Had to find answers. Something. Anything. Because if he didn't, he wasn't sure how much longer he could take this. Jake forced himself to drive. The road still felt wrong, like the world had folded in on itself. But after what felt like hours, he finally reached a small town. It barely looked lived in, just a handful of old brick buildings, a gas station, and a library. The streets were eerily empty. No cars. No people. Like the whole town was holding its breath. Jake didn't care. He parked the RV in front of the library and stumbled inside. The place was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the scent of aged paper. An elderly librarian sat behind the front desk, watching him. Her pale blue eyes didn't blink. Jake swallowed hard and forced himself to speak. I need information on local urban legends. Mirrors. Strange occurrences." The librarian tilted her head. Then, without a word, she stood and disappeared into the back. Jake's skin prickled. Something about this place felt off. He turned to the bookshelves, scanning for anything useful. His fingers skimmed across titles. The Phantom Roads. Vanished without a trace. Reflections of the Unseen. His stomach knotted at that last one. He yanked the book off the shelf and flipped through the brittle pages. And then, he stopped. His breath caught. There it was. A passage describing a shadow that only appears in mirrors. A figure that latches onto travelers. That traps them. That feeds on their fear. Jake's pulse hammered. This was it. This was what was haunting him. But the page had been ripped in half. The rest of the story gone. Jake spun, gripping the book tight. The librarian stood behind him. Too close. Too silent. Her cloudy blue eyes bore into his. "You shouldn't be looking for it," she said softly. Jake's throat dried. I need to know how to stop it." The librarian exhaled, gaze flickering to the book in his hands. She hesitated. Then, in a whisper, she said, "It's not in the books." Jake frowned. "Then where?" The librarian's lips pressed into a thin line. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, almost reluctantly, she muttered, "There's a man. Out past Dead Hollow Road. He knows about the mirrors." Jake's fingers tightened on the book. "What's his name?" The librarian's eyes darkened. "He doesn't have one anymore." A chill crawled up Jake's spine. But he didn't have a choice. He needed answers, no matter where they led him. Dead Hollow Road wasn't on the GPS. Jake had to follow handwritten directions the librarian scrawled on an old receipt. The drive took him deep into the woods. The trees gnarled and twisted like reaching hands. The road was barely a path, more dirt than pavement. And the sun, which should have been rising, looked stuck in twilight. Then, at the end of the road, he saw it. A cabin. Small. Old. Rotting. And in front of it, a man. He sat on a rocking chair, staring at Jake's RV like he had been expecting him. Jake killed the engine and hesitated. The man's face was deeply lined, his eyes dark and sunken, like someone who had spent too many nights not sleeping. "You saw it, didn't you?" the man finally spoke. Jake stiffened. "The thing in the mirror." Jake swallowed hard. "Yes." The man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Then you don't have much time." The man led Jake inside the cabin. It was cluttered with old books, broken clocks, and mirrors, dozens of them. But every single one was covered. Sheets. Paint. Scratches. Like he had spent years trying to keep something out. Jake's pulse quickened. "Tell me what this thing is." The man exhaled, sinking into a battered armchair. "It's not a ghost. Not a demon. It's older than those things." Jake's stomach churned. "Then what is it?" The man's expression darkened. "A reflection that walks." Jake's skin crawled. The man continued. "It chooses people who look too long. People who catch glimpses of it in mirrors. It starts small, just a flicker in the corner of your eye. Then one night it stays." Jake's breath hitched. The man's voice dropped lower. "It doesn't just watch. It studies you. Learns you. Until one day." He trailed off. Jake's heart pounded. "Until what?" The man's lips barely moved. "Until it knows you better than you do. And then," he tapped his temple, "it takes your place." A sickening dread washed over Jake. His mind reeled. If that was true, then every time he had seen his reflection move on its own, it had been learning, mimicking, waiting. Jake's breathing turned shallow. "How do I stop it?" The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at the covered mirrors. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You don't." Jake's stomach dropped. "There has to be a way." The man shook his head. "You don't kill it. You don't banish it. The only way to be free is to..." He hesitated, and then his gaze met Jake's. "Trick it." Jake frowned. "Trick it how?" The man leaned forward. "Make it take the wrong version of you." Jake's blood turned cold. This thing, it wanted to replace him. But what if? What if he gave it something else to take? Jake's pulse raced. He didn't know how. Didn't know if it would work. But if this was his only shot, he'd take it, before it was too late. Because one thing was certain. If he didn't act soon, the man in the side mirror would step out. And Jake would be the one trapped inside. The man in the side mirror. Jake drove back to the RV as the sun dipped below the trees, bleeding the sky into dark reds and deep blues. But he already knew this would be his last night. The air felt heavier. His reflection in the windshield didn't blink when he did. He gripped the wheel tighter. The old man's words pounded in his skull. "Trick it. Make it take the wrong version of you." How the hell was he supposed to do that? The RV rumbled onto an empty stretch of highway. Dark. Endless. And then, the side mirror shifted. Jake's breath hitched. The reflection wasn't his. Not anymore. The man in the side mirror was there, motionless. It sat in the passenger seat. A shadowy version of Jake, with a too-wide grin. Watching. Waiting. Jake's knuckles turned white on the wheel. This thing had been mimicking him for days. Learning. And tonight, it was ready. Jake knew running wouldn't work. This thing wasn't bound to a place. It was bound to him. But he had an idea. A desperate, terrifying idea. He slammed the brakes. The RV screeched to a halt on the abandoned highway. Jake killed the engine, leaving the road drenched in darkness. The only light, the reflection in the mirror. The man in the side mirror didn't move. It just grinned. Jake's pulse pounded. This had to work. It was all he had left. He reached over and yanked a small hand mirror from the glove compartment. Held it up, facing the side mirror. For the first time, the figure's grin faltered. It twitched. Its form glitched, like a video feed struggling to process. Jake's breath quickened. It doesn't like being reflected. Good. That meant it could be confused. Maybe even tricked. He just had to push it further. A soft tapping echoed through the RV. Jake froze. The door handle jiggled. His stomach twisted. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore. Slowly, so painfully slowly, he turned his head. Outside, barely visible in the faint moonlight, a figure stood at the door. Not a shadow, not a reflection, but a solid shape. A man. And even though Jake could only see the outline, he already knew. It was him, or at least the thing trying to be him. A slow, distorted version of his own voice rasped. "Let me in." Jake's blood turned to ice. The mirror trick wasn't enough. The thing had studied him. It was ready. It wanted to take his place. And if he made the wrong move, it would. Jake's mind raced. The old man had said he needed to trick it. But how? Then a thought struck him. A gamble. A dangerous one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a second mirror. This one was cracked. A shard missing from the top corner. Jake had found it in the cabin earlier. And now, staring at the thing outside his RV, he realized something. The cracks. If this thing had been mirroring him, learning him, maybe it had copied something wrong. Maybe it thought the cracked reflection was him. Jake swallowed hard. He had to bet everything on this. His shaking fingers raised the cracked mirror to his face. And he smiled. Outside, the thing twitched. Hesitated. Then slowly it mirrored him. A twisted, distorted version of his grin. The cracks in the mirror spread across its face. Yes. Jake's pulse thundered. It was believing the lie. He lowered the mirror, voice steady. "You're me now." For a moment, nothing. Then, the thing lurched. Its face warped. Darkness bled through its skin, the cracks widening. It staggered backward. No, not backward. Back into the mirror. Jake's breath caught. It was pulling itself in, believing it belonged there. Its form twisted, sucked into the reflective surface. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, the mirror shattered. Glass exploded, fragments slicing through the air. Jake shielded his face. And then silence. Jake's heartbeat was deafening. He lowered his arms. Glass shards littered the floor. The side mirror gone. No shadow. No figure. Just a dull, cracked frame. A shudder racked his body. It had worked. The man in the side mirror was gone. Or, Jake's stomach twisted. What if? It was still watching? What if he was the one who had been pulled into the wrong side? He turned. Slowly. Every fiber of his being screamed, "Don't look." But he had to. He stepped toward the RV's rearview mirror, held his breath, and looked. His reflection stared back. Normal. No smile. No delay. Just him. Jake's knees nearly buckled. He let out a shaky half-laugh. It was over. It was really over. He stumbled to the driver's seat and turned the key. The RV roared to life. He didn't look at the mirrors again. Didn't want to. Didn't need to. He was free. He drove. Hours passed. The road stretched ahead, empty and silent. Dawn crept up, painting the sky in soft orange and pink. Jake's exhaustion pulled at him. But he didn't stop. Didn't dare. Then, a flicker. Out of the corner of his eye. His breath hitched. No, it was just his imagination. It had to be. He risked a glance at the rearview mirror. And there, just for a second, his reflection smiled. Not him. The other him. Jake's blood turned to ice. His reflection's lips moved. Soundless words he could barely decipher. But he knew what it said. "Let me out." Jake's hands were shaking. His throat was dry. But he kept driving. Faster. The RV's tires hummed against the asphalt as the sun crawled higher, casting golden light over the endless stretch of road ahead. It should have felt safe. Relief should have washed over him. But he couldn't shake the lingering unease. That final glimpse in the mirror. The smile. The silent words, "Let me out." Jake gritted his teeth. No, it was a trick. The thing was gone. He had won. Hadn't he? He forced himself to focus on the road, ignoring the gnawing doubt at the edges of his mind. Don't look in the mirrors. Don't give it a reason to come back. His muscles ached from tension. His eyes burned from exhaustion. But he couldn't stop. Not yet. He needed to reach civilization. Somewhere crowded. Somewhere real. Somewhere the thing couldn't follow. An end to all of this. An hour passed. Then two. The highway stretched endlessly. Too endlessly. Jake's fingers tightened around the wheel. He should have hit a town by now. A gas station. A diner. Something. But the road just kept stretching forward. Empty. Silent. Wrong. His pulse quickened. Was this another trick? Had he not escaped at all? His breathing turned ragged, panic clawing at his chest. Then, a sign appeared in the distance. Jake squinted. Willow Creek, 10 miles. His stomach unclenched just a little. Willow Creek. A real place. A real town. He wasn't trapped. Relief, thick and dizzying, nearly knocked the air from his lungs. Just a little further. Willow Creek was a small town, nestled along the highway. One long stretch of gas stations, diners, and motels. Jake pulled into the first gas station he saw. A small, dusty place with an old neon sign flickering overhead. The relief was immediate. People. Cars. Lights. Real life. He climbed out of the RV, his legs shaking. The station attendant, an older man with weathered hands, watched him closely. Like he knew something. Jake swallowed. Maybe he looked like hell. He felt like it. Ignoring the stares, he headed inside. Cool air blasted him as he stepped into the dimly lit store. Rows of snacks. A humming soda machine. A radio crackled in the background, playing an old, warbling country song. Normal. It felt so normal. Until he saw the mirror. It hung behind the register. A large, slightly warped pane of glass, reflecting the store. Jake stopped cold. His reflection was there. Watching. But something was off. The man behind the register frowned. You alright, son? Jake tore his gaze away. Yeah. Just tired. The attendant gave him a long, knowing look. Like he'd seen this before. Like he knew something. Jake exhaled shakily. It was just paranoia. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was. His eyes flicked back to the mirror. His reflection didn't look away. Jake's mouth went dry. His reflection should have followed his movement. But it didn't. It just stood there, smiling. Slowly, it lifted a hand. Jake's own arm remained at his side. His stomach dropped. The attendant saw the color drain from his face. You should leave, the man murmured, voice low. Now. Jake stumbled backward. The reflection stepped forward. The mirror's surface rippled. Like water. Jake turned and bolted. His boots pounded against the pavement. The RV, get to the RV. Jake yanked the door open, heart hammering. The engine roared to life. He slammed his foot on the gas. The RV lurched forward, tires screeching. He had to get out. Had to. Something moved in the rearview mirror. Jake's breath hitched. A figure. Not on the road. Not outside. Inside. In the back of the RV. A shadowy shape, standing in the hallway. Watching him. Jake's hands tightened on the wheel. He couldn't look. Couldn't acknowledge it. If he did, it would know. He kept his eyes locked on the road. But the thing stepped closer. And closer. Until a cold breath ghosted against his ear. You're in my seat. Jake lost control. The RV swerved. The wheels screeched against the pavement. For a split second, Jake saw the reflection in the windshield. Not his. The other him. Smiling. The RV flipped. Glass shattered. Metal groaned. Jake's world turned black. A ringing in his ears. Pain in his ribs. Jake's eyes fluttered open. He was lying on the road. The RV was a crumpled wreck. Distant voices shouted. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness. Paramedics swarmed around him. Jake coughed, vision swimming. Somehow he had survived. Somehow he had. A flicker of movement. He turned his head. His stomach dropped. In the shattered side mirror of the wreckage, a figure stood. Not a reflection. Not an illusion. A man. Standing outside the mirror. Watching. Jake recognized him. Himself. His own face. His own eyes. But the expression wasn't his. A paramedic knelt beside him. Sir, stay still. We're going to get you to the hospital. Jake's throat tightened. He couldn't breathe. The other Jake took a step closer. And then, he walked away, blending into the crowd, into the world, taking his place. Jake tried to scream, but no sound came, because deep inside, he already knew. He was the one still trapped in the mirror. Next story. The night stretched endlessly on the open highway, a yawning void of black asphalt and ghostly white lines illuminated by the RV's headlights. Lucas adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his fingers tightening as fatigue clawed at the edges of his mind. The road had been empty for hours, with no sign of another vehicle, no gas stations, no rest stops, just an unbroken stretch of nothingness. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering over the screen, debating whether to put on some music to drown out the silence. Instead, he let out a slow breath, opting to keep his focus on the road. The hum of the RV's engine was steady, rhythmic, a lonely heartbeat in the vast emptiness. Then, without warning, the radio clicked on. Lucas startled, his eyes flicking to the dashboard. The dial had been set to off, something he was sure of because he hadn't used the radio at all during his trip. The volume was low, almost a whisper, as soft static crackled through the speakers. He frowned, reaching out to twist the knob off, but the static didn't stop. "Great," he muttered. "Faulty wiring." Then, beneath the static, something shifted. A voice. Lucas felt a chill creep down his spine as the faintest trace of words broke through the interference. It was distorted, garbled, as if submerged in water, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was speaking. A plea? A whisper? He couldn't be sure. He leaned closer, turning the volume up slightly, straining to make sense of it. "Help me." Lucas's stomach dropped. His fingers hovered over the knob, unsure whether to turn it off or listen further. The voice was distant, like it was calling from another place, another time. The words wavered, barely audible beneath the static, but there was urgency in them. Another garbled phrase crackled through. "He's coming. Don't let him hear you." The hairs on the back of Lucas's neck stood up. A distorted shriek suddenly ripped through the speakers, high-pitched and unnatural, cutting through the night like a blade. Lucas swore, his hands jerking the wheel slightly. His heart pounded as he quickly reached for the volume knob, twisting it all the way down. Silence. His breathing was ragged. He kept his hands firm on the wheel, eyes flicking nervously to the radio, waiting for it to do something else. But the screen was blank, the dial still turned off. Lucas shook his head, forcing out a nervous chuckle. "Just interference," he muttered. "Some late-night transmission from a station out of range." But even as he said it, he knew it didn't make sense. His eyes flickered to the road. A few miles ahead, a lone road sign loomed in his headlights. He squinted as he passed it, reading the faded numbers painted on its metal face. Mile marker 237. The static returned. This time, the voice wasn't a whisper. This time, it was his own voice. "Lucas," it rasped. "You have to turn back." Lucas's foot slammed on the brake. The RV screeched to a halt in the middle of the deserted highway. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stared at the radio, his own voice still crackling through the static. "Turn back," it repeated. "Now." Then, the radio went silent. The night stretched out once more, vast and empty. But Lucas had the overwhelming feeling that he was no longer alone. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the windshield, casting long, warm streaks across the dashboard. Lucas rubbed his face, exhausted. He had barely slept after the radio incident. Every time he had dozed off, he woke with a start, half expecting the voice to return, the static to creep back into the air like a phantom whispering in his ear. He took a deep breath and pulled back onto the road. Maybe he had been more tired than he realized. Maybe his mind had played tricks on him. Long hours on the highway could do that, right? As the miles rolled by, Lucas forced himself to push the memory aside. The highway was normal again. Other cars appeared in the distance. The occasional diner or gas station broke up the monotony of the road. He even stopped for coffee at a roadside cafe, where the scent of bacon and fresh pastries grounded him back in reality. He chatted briefly with an old couple traveling in an RV similar to his. They spoke about their journey, sharing small-town recommendations and warnings about rough stretches of road ahead. It felt normal, comforting. Lucas allowed himself to relax. Maybe he had imagined it all. Back in the RV, he switched on the radio, half expecting static. Instead, a pop song crackled through the speakers. He chuckled. "See? Just a fluke." The hours ticked by. Lucas felt himself settling into the road trip again, his grip on the wheel less tense, his mind no longer clouded by paranoia. The road stretched ahead, peaceful, predictable. Then, as he passed a gas station, a small detail sent a shiver through him. A sign in the window, handwritten in black marker. Don't listen to the radio. Lucas's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. His mouth went dry. It was probably nothing. Just a joke. Some local superstition, maybe. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The drive had been ordinary up until this point. The road stretched out in endless darkness, the headlights of the RV carving a path through the void. The occasional highway sign flashed by, illuminated just long enough to remind him that civilization was still out there somewhere. Jesse checked the clock. 1:37 a.m. Late, but not unusual for a night drive. The road was mostly empty aside from the occasional 18-wheeler roaring past in the opposite lane. He reached for his coffee, taking a sip of the lukewarm liquid, willing the caffeine to keep him alert. Then the radio crackled to life. Not the static he sometimes heard when scanning for stations in remote areas. Not a song fading in and out of reception. This was something else entirely. A voice. Distorted. Muffled. Distant. Can hear me? Is anyone there? Jesse nearly spilled his coffee. He hadn't turned the radio on. In fact, he was sure he had switched it off hours ago. His fingers hovered over the dial as he glanced down at the display. No station. No frequency. Just empty air. The voice returned, more urgent this time. Please help. I don't have much time. A chill crawled up Jesse's spine. He turned the dial, trying to change the station, but the radio wouldn't budge. The display remained blank, as if it weren't even tuned in to anything at all. Hello? Jesse finally spoke, his voice cracking slightly. It felt absurd, talking to an empty frequency, but something about the voice sounded too real, too human to ignore. V seeking answers. The static on the RV's radio had become an unbearable presence, a ghostly whisper clawing at the edges of reality. The driver, Jake, refused to believe it was mere interference. The messages, pleas for help from voices that didn't exist, had to have a source. There had to be a reason. Determined, Jake pulled into the next town, a forgotten speck on the map with a single gas station, a diner, and a general store whose neon sign flickered in protest against the night. He parked beside the gas pumps, stepping out into the cool, dry air, his nerves still on edge. The radio remained silent for the first time in hours, almost as if it was watching him, waiting. His first stop was the diner, a relic from another era. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, drawing the attention of the few locals nursing their coffees. He slid into a booth, ordering a black coffee before pulling out his phone. The internet had been useless in his search for explanations, but he tried again, typing in phrases like RV radio ghost voices and phantom transmissions. The results were filled with urban legends, conspiracy theories, and ghost stories, none of which explained why it was happening to him. An elderly man sitting at the counter eyed him for a long moment before getting up and shuffling over. You look troubled, son, the man said, his voice a rasp. What brings you to our little town? Jake hesitated before deciding to be honest. My radio's been playing something weird. Distress calls, voices. But no one's there. Ever heard of something like that? The old man's expression darkened. He slid into the booth across from Jake, lowering his voice. You ain't the first. Folks who pass through here sometimes pick up things. Not normal things. Messages from the past, voices of the lost. Some say it's the highway. Others say it's the land itself. Jake frowned. The past? What do you mean? Ever heard of the Phantom Channel? The old man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Some say it's a frequency between life and death, a place where echoes of tragedies past still linger. It finds people like you, travelers who listen. Jake's skin prickled. How do I stop it? The old man sighed. You might not be able to. Some people say it follows them forever. Others, well, some just disappear. A sharp crackle of static erupted from Jake's pocket. He yanked out his phone, but it wasn't coming from there. It was coming from inside the diner. A small radio behind the counter flickered to life. The voices returned, whispering, desperate. Jake's breath hitched as the words became clearer. Turn back. Don't go. The road is wrong. He shoved himself out of the booth, ignoring the stares of the other patrons as he sprinted out of the diner, back to the RV. He needed to leave. He needed to get answers before it was too late. His next stop, the abandoned radio tower marked on his map, miles away in the desert. If the voices were coming from anywhere, that had to be it. As he started the RV and pulled onto the road, the radio came alive once more. This time, the voice wasn't unfamiliar. It was his own. Jake, don't go. You don't come back from this. His hands clenched the wheel. He had no choice now. He had to find the truth. A heavy silence followed, stretching out long enough that Jesse started to wonder if he had imagined it. Maybe the fatigue was playing tricks on him. Then the voice returned. This time it was screaming. "He's here. He's coming. He's..." The voice cut off. The radio died. The silence in the RV was deafening. Jesse's pulse pounded in his ears. His hands gripped the wheel, his knuckles turning white. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It was just a glitch, a stray transmission, some distant signal bouncing off the atmosphere in the dead of night. That had to be it. But then, thump, a sound from inside the RV. Jesse snapped his head toward the passenger seat. For a split second, just a fraction of a moment, he saw something. A shadowy outline in the reflection of the windshield. Then it was gone. Jesse swerved, jerking the wheel as the RV drifted onto the rumble strips. His breath came in short, uneven bursts. His heart was hammering. He pulled over. He had to. The RV idled on the side of the road, the engine humming softly in the otherwise dead silence. Jesse sat motionless, hands still clutching the wheel, his breath shaky. He turned, scanning the interior. Nothing. The small kitchenette, the couch, the narrow hallway leading to the back, everything was exactly as it should be. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Jesse reached for his phone, needing something, anything, to ground himself. He unlocked the screen, his thumb hovering over the call icon. He debated dialing someone, even if just to hear another voice. Then the radio turned back on. No static this time. No distortion. Just a single sound. Breathing. Slow, deliberate. Not his. Jesse's blood turned to ice. He reached for the ignition, ready to gun it down the highway, when the voice whispered through the speakers. "You shouldn't have stopped." Jesse's body went cold. Something moved in the rearview mirror. A shadow. Not behind him. Not outside. But inside the RV. Jesse didn't think. He didn't breathe. He just hit the gas. The RV lurched forward, tires screeching as it sped back onto the highway. His eyes flicked between the road and the mirror, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his fingers ached. The shadow was gone. The breathing had stopped. And the radio was playing his own voice. "Hello." Jesse's stomach dropped. It was playing the exact words he had spoken earlier. An echo. A delay. A recording. Jesse felt nausea churn in his stomach. He turned the radio off, yanked the knob so hard it nearly broke. The RV was silent again. But Jesse knew. Whatever had spoken to him through that static, whatever had been inside the RV, it wasn't gone. And it wasn't done. Jesse's hands trembled on the steering wheel as he sped down the highway, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. The RV's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty stretch of road ahead, but it did nothing to quell the sheer terror coiling in his gut. The radio remained off, silent, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like an unseen force. He had heard his own voice played back to him. Something had been inside the RV, and worst of all, he had felt like it was still there. Jesse's breath came in short bursts as he tried to form a plan. He had to get somewhere, anywhere, with people. He needed noise, lights, a connection to something real. His eyes darted to the GPS screen. The next rest stop was 27 miles away. "Just keep driving," he muttered under his breath. "Just get there. Just get." The headlights flickered. Jesse's stomach clenched. He tapped the dashboard as if that would somehow fix the issue, but before he could react, the radio snapped back on. "Please. Someone help me." A woman's voice this time. Desperate. Screaming. Jesse's breath caught in his throat. His fingers hovered over the knob, but he hesitated. What if this one was real? What if someone out there actually needed help? Static swallowed the voice before it could finish. Then the breathing started again. Slow. Deep. Inside the RV. Jesse's blood ran cold. Then the lights cut out completely. The RV plunged into total darkness. The only illumination came from the dim glow of the instrument panel and the faint moonlight seeping through the windshield. Jesse let out a shaky breath, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He couldn't stop now, wouldn't stop. But with the headlights dead, he was essentially flying blind at 70 miles per hour down an unlit highway. He needed to pull over, even for just a moment, just to. Thump. Something moved in the back of the RV. Jesse's breath hitched. Thump. 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 Footsteps. Getting closer. His heart pounded. He reached into the passenger seat, fumbling for his phone. The second he turned it on, he gasped. The screen, completely distorted. The clock flickered between 1:37 a.m. and 3:19 a.m., as if time itself was shifting. A single notification glitched across the display. A message. It wasn't from a saved number. It simply read, "Don't look." Jesse swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his ears. He didn't dare check the mirror, didn't dare look behind him. Then the whisper came, right next to his ear. "You're not driving alone." Jesse screamed. He wrenched the wheel to the right, sending the RV skidding onto the shoulder. The tires screeched as the vehicle lurched, throwing him forward. A jolt of pain shot through his shoulder as he slammed into the steering column. Then, everything went silent. The RV had stopped. Jesse gasped for air, his body trembling as he tried to gather his bearings. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, suffocating the cabin. And then, the radio clicked back on. Soft static at first. Then his own voice. "Just keep driving. Just get there. Just get." Jesse froze. That was him. From earlier. Something had been listening. Something had been recording. Jesse reached for the door handle, his breath hitching. He had to get out. He had to. Thump. The sound came from right behind him. Jesse squeezed his eyes shut. "Don't turn around. Don't look. Don't." A cold breath touched the back of his neck. "Turn it back on." Jesse snapped his eyes open and lunged for the ignition. The RV roared to life, its headlights flickering back on as he stomped the gas pedal to the floor. The wheels screeched against the asphalt as the vehicle lurched forward, barreling down the highway at reckless speed. He refused to check the mirror. He refused to see if something was there. The rest stop was still miles away, but he didn't care. He needed to get away. The radio, now crackling with static again, pulsed with a rhythmic clicking sound. Jesse tried to ignore it, his grip tightening on the wheel. But then he recognized the pattern. Morse code. Jesse's stomach twisted. He didn't know Morse code offhand, but the deliberate pattern of long and short bursts was unmistakable. Something was communicating with him. And then, the radio spoke again. "This road never ends." Jesse's breath caught. The GPS was still up on the screen. He glanced at it, praying that he was getting closer to civilization. But the route was glitching. His location flickered back and forth between the same 2-mile stretch of highway. No matter how fast he drove, he wasn't moving. Jesse's grip on the wheel tightened. His entire body was shaking. He couldn't think straight, couldn't focus. The road ahead looked the same, empty, endless black. Then he saw them. Headlights. A row of them, coming toward him in the distance. Jesse's heart leaped in his chest. A truck stopped. A diner. Anything, anywhere with people. But as he got closer, his stomach dropped. The vehicles weren't on the road. They were hovering, suspended in the air, perfectly aligned, their headlights beaming through the darkness, glitching in and out of existence. Jesse's pulse thundered in his ears. His vision blurred at the edges. He pressed the gas harder, desperate to break free of whatever this was. Then the radio spoke one final time. "Turn back." Jesse screamed in frustration. "I can't." The headlights ahead vanished. The road was empty again, like nothing had ever been there. Jesse gasped, his breath ragged and uneven. His entire body felt like it was collapsing in on itself. Then, his phone screen flickered again. Another message appeared. It read, "You've already tried." Jesse felt his mind break. He didn't know how long he had been driving. He didn't know if he was really moving at all. But the worst realization of all crept in like a slow poison. The radio had never turned on by itself. He had turned it on, and he had been listening ever since. Jake's hands trembled on the wheel as the dark road stretched endlessly before him. The desert night was still oppressive, as if the world itself held its breath. The radio, his tormentor, had gone eerily silent since he'd left the town behind. But he knew it wasn't over. It was never over. The highway ahead cut through miles of barren landscape, leading to the abandoned radio tower he'd found on the map. It was his only lead, his only chance at understanding what had latched onto him. As the RV roared forward, the air inside felt heavier, thick with something unseen yet unmistakably present. He checked the mirrors reflexively. Nothing but the stretch of asphalt behind him. And yet, he felt watched. A crackling noise shattered the silence, making Jake flinch. The radio flickered back to life, the static warping into a garbled voice. "Stop. Don't go." Jake's heart pounded, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, gripping the wheel tighter. The voice faltered, overlapping with others, whispering, pleading, screaming. He turned the dial, but the voices only grew more frantic. "You were warned. It's too late." Lights appeared in the distance, tall, skeletal structures silhouetted against the moonlight. The radio tower. Jake exhaled sharply, relief battling with dread. He pulled off the road and onto a dirt path leading up to it. The closer he got, the more the radio protested, the voices escalating into a cacophony of fear and rage. "Go back! Go back!" The RV shuddered violently, as if something unseen had latched onto it. The headlights flickered, the engine coughed. A shadow passed by the windshield. No, not outside. Inside. Jake jerked back, gasping, but there was nothing there. The air, however, had changed. It was colder. Wrong. He grabbed the flashlight and a crowbar from under the seat, forcing himself to step outside. The night was deafeningly quiet apart from the hum of static pouring from the RV speakers. The radio tower loomed ahead, rusted and ancient, its fence barely holding together. The gate swung open with a groan, inviting him inside. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he stepped forward, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound. Then, the radio inside the RV screamed. Jake whirled around. The windows of the RV flickered, shapes moving within, impossible shadows shifting in the dim glow. His body locked up in primal terror. He wanted to run, to escape, but his feet refused to move. And then the voice came, clearer than ever before. Louder. Familiar. Jake. It was his voice. The ground beneath him felt unstable, the air vibrating around him as if reality itself was fraying at the edges. His own voice continued, speaking words he hadn't yet said, warnings he hadn't yet given. "You don't come back from this." A hand, cold, lifeless, gripped his shoulder. Jake screamed. Jake's scream echoed through the empty night as he spun around, swinging the crowbar blindly. But there was nothing, just the cold air, thick with static. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as his own voice continued to whisper from the RV's radio, distorted yet eerily calm. "You don't come back from this." He stumbled backward, barely catching himself before he hit the rusted fence. His breath came in frantic gasps. The air smelled metallic, sharp, unnatural. He turned back to the RV, and his stomach clenched. The driver's seat was occupied. It was him. A perfect reflection of himself sat behind the wheel, hands gripping the steering column, eyes empty and glassy. The doppelganger's lips moved, but the words came from the radio. It was always going to end this way. Jake felt an overwhelming pull toward the RV, his feet moving involuntarily. He fought against it, his mind screaming at him to run, to escape. But the closer he got, the heavier his body felt. The static grew louder, suffocating, filling his skull like a swarm of voices pushing and pulling at his mind. Then, darkness. Jake's eyes snapped open. He was behind the wheel. The radio was silent. The sun was rising, casting an eerie glow over the desert. His knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. He took a shuddering breath, his entire body slick with sweat. Had it been a dream? He turned to check the passenger seat, empty. The RV was normal. No shadows, no voices, just the hum of the engine. Relief flooded him. He laughed shakily, rubbing his face. Maybe he had finally lost it. The radio crackled. A voice came through. His voice. "Wake up!" The road in front of him disappeared. The world blinked out, and he was back at the radio tower, standing outside the RV, staring at his own lifeless body slumped in the driver's seat. The static rose again, deafening, until it was all-consuming. And then, silence. A new morning dawned, and the RV sat abandoned on the roadside. The radio inside was off, its dials untouched. Somewhere far away, a distress call crackled through an unseen frequency. "Help! I don't know where I am."